Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Whiskey and Wires. I am John Bingham, and I like amps just a little too much. If you do as well, please subscribe and support the channel. Today I am here with legendary amp designer, mad scientist, Steve Fryette. What's happening? I'm great, man. This is so much. This is fun for me. You have, you're a bit of a pioneer, so this is a moment for me where I'm happy as hell to be here.
Well, thank you. That's a compliment, and it's funny when people say things like that to me, because I always think of the pioneers as, the Leo Fenders and Randall Smiths of the world. So when I'm spoken of in that context, it feels weird on me. So
sorry,
but
I'll take it back. Layman Steve Fryette is here with me. I'm just kidding.
When I first started teaching myself how to play guitar, my father, who was I didn't appreciate this till later, but he was really a guitar junkie, but not electric guitar junkie. He just liked the instrument, and he especially liked the classical guitar. So he was into Segovia.
Okay.
He was fascinated with Segovia and other classical and flamenco guitarists. And so he had a lot of their albums, and he was taking lessons to learn how to play guitar. He had a inexpensive nylon string guitar that had the music stand and the music and the footrest and the technique and the posture and all that he worked on, and he would do the da 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 da. He would work on that, and then when I switched from drums to guitar, I just started playing guitar, and he said, "Why don't you show me how you do that? Because I'm going and I'm taking lessons, but I don't really feel like I'm understanding the instrument. You really understand the instrument." He's like, "Show me how you do that." And I'm like, "Dad, I can't, because I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. I'm just faking it." He goes, "But you're holding the guitar right, and you sound really good, and you've learned really quickly, and you have a gift for music. So you how do you do that?" And I go, "Just show me a couple of things." I said, "Dad, I'm not trying to blow you off. It's not because I don't want to hang out with you. I don't know what to tell you because I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I couldn't even name this chord that I'm playing right now. I just listened to it off of a record. I can't even tell you what it is. I don't know the names of the strings. I don't know anything about this. I just know that when you do this and you do this, it goes wham, and that's what I want it to sound like, and that's all I can tell you." And he went,
amazing.
"All right, I give up." He didn't accept that. He didn't understand that I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and how can I teach you? All I can tell you is just keep at it. So I think later on he sort of accepted that, but at the very beginning he thought I was just like too busy being antisocial,
sure,
rock and roll, getting out of the house and away from the parents to really spend time with them, and that wasn't the case.
Is that same sort of magic, kind of the same approach that happened to your your career now, to your amplifier building? Did you just kind of experiment your way into it?
Yeah, I experimented, went my way backwards into both of them, and the reason for that is because they're two warring sides of me. They're always at war. To this very day, I still don't know if I will prefer to be a guitar player or a designer, even though I'm both. I already am both, and a drummer. I still have my drum kit, and I toy around with the idea of like jamming with some people and starting a band, playing drums now instead of screwing around with guitar. I play with guitar every day. I don't know. Those two aspects of my personality are constantly at war. And one of them wins out over the other one for a while, and then it switches. It's like when the Earth, the magnetic pole collapses and reverses.
Sure.
Every millennia or whatever. That's what happens with me. My universe collapses and reverses, and then I just only want to think about it and focus on music. And then I don't know, reality pushes in on me and it reverses again, and it's back to the soldering iron and the design software and all of that stuff. And I even, when I was working in a repair shop, after I left working at the repair shops, sold all of my equipment, sold all of my tools, donated all of my schematics that I accumulated to the last repair job that I had, got it out of the house so I would never see it. And 6 months later, it was all back.
Right.
It was like a magnetic field, just like all this stuff just came back to me. And it's always been that way. I've got 8 guitars right here and 2 amps and all of these reminders that there's a dormant part of me just like fighting to get oxygen. It's like a split personality.
There's something so ironic about the comparisons that you're making about things being drawn to you and the magnetism and everything, just from the standpoint that we work with electronics.
Well, I've always, from the time I was a little kid, I was interested in science and electronics and mechanical things. And when I was a child, I took things apart and broke my toys, taking them apart to see how they worked.
Sure.
And my parents would try to find toys that could not be taken apart. And that meant that I had to figure out how to take them apart to see how they worked, and then figure out how to put them back together so that they wouldn't see that they had been taken apart. That means that I had to learn how to put them back together, how they worked, and then figure out how to put them back together so that way they worked again when I put them back together. So there was these two things that still are with me: the challenge of getting it back together, and the thing of not being afraid to not be able to put it back together, that fear that it's going to be broken and I'm going to get in trouble. So I had one of the toys that I had gotten when I was 5 or 6 or 7 was this little plastic dashboard of a car. Had a steering wheel and a windshield and windshield wipers and a radio dials and push buttons and stuff. And it was battery powered, and you put it on the table and drive sitting at the kitchen table with the steering wheel and the little dashboard with all the stuff to play with.
Sure.
And it was all plastic, and it had this fiberboard back on it that was attached by these little plastic studs that fit over these studs, and then they melted the top of the studs to seal the back piece onto the back. So if you took it off and you broke those studs, you couldn't get it back on. But my dad had a soldering iron that he used. It had this fitting on it that he used for putting the putty in windows when he repaired the windows. When he replaced a broken window, he had this thing that heated the putty and laid it out flat. And it was a soldering iron. And that thing was kind of flat. It wasn't like a tip of a soldering iron. It wasn't really super hot. It was just kind of hot, but it was hot enough to melt plastic. And I figured out how to use that to flatten off those plastic studs so that the back would slide off. So I could see inside and figure out how it worked. And then I put the back on and then use that thing to flatten the tops of those little plastic studs again so you could not tell that it was taken apart.
No kidding.
I satisfied my curiosity. I never felt like I needed to open it up again. I figured it out, but I got it put back together before they got home, and it worked. And they were never wise to the fact that I got that thing apart and back together. So that's always been that thing has been with me all the time, and it got more progressive my mom used to, when she would vacuum, she would yank the cord out of the wall, and after a few times of that, she'd yank the cord. The plug would stay in the wall, but the cord came out, and it would short and blow a fuse. So I figured out how to replace a fuse. No, wait till your father comes home. No, I know where it is. There's a box downstairs. You open the door, and there's little glass things, and you spin them out. And I'm 5, I'm 6, I'm 7. And you take that out, and you put one in, and then everything works. And no. And so she went to the grocery store, and I rewired the plug to the vacuum cleaner and plugged it into the wall. Okay, no smoke. And I went and replaced the fuse, and okay, the fuse doesn't blow. And I went up and turned the vacuum cleaner. Okay, it works. We're good. And she got home, and when I saw her driving up to the house, I turned on the vacuum cleaner and I started vacuuming the living room. When she came in, she was like, this. I'm just like, oh, how was the grocery store? And I'm vacuuming. And she's like, how are you doing that? And what? I just kind of played dumb.
That's amazing.
So,
was your dad real handy when you were a kid? Was he kind of making you hold the flashlight and all that sort of stuff?
My dad was the classic Renaissance man.
Yeah.
He was the guy that could do anything he put his mind to, whether it be electronics or art or literature or mechanical things or sales. He had all kinds of things that he could do. And if he couldn't do it, he would go to the library and check out a book and read and learn how to do it, and then he would do it. He learned how to rebuild an engine and replace a transmission and do plumbing in the house and all these things. I didn't really realize that. I talked to my mom a few years ago about where he learned all of these things, and she said he was just one of those guys that when an opportunity presented itself to him, he would try to take advantage of it. And,
that's awesome.
And then he would go figure it out afterwards. And I think I kind of learned some of that from him. Sure. I remember him telling a story of being applying for a job that a lot of guys were applying for. And one of the things that they had to do was read a blueprint. And so the foreman shows the blueprint to a couple of guys of how do these read, and the guys would kind of stumble and blah blah blah. So he hands the blueprint to my dad, and my dad unrolls it and he looks at it and he goes, how does this blueprint read? And my dad says, it reads just fine to me, and rolls it up and handed it back to him, and they hired him.
Huh.
And it wasn't because of anything other than he just had this sort of presence and determination, and he this charisma. He put it out there.
Right.
Yeah, this is a no-brainer for me. He had that confidence.
That sounds great.
So when I moved down here from Seattle, I banged around and played in some bands, and eventually worked my way to Los Angeles, and I got in this original band after playing clubs in Orange County for a year or so, and got sick of it. So I started working my way up to LA to find out if there was some exciting original rock and roll music happening in spite of the disco revolution and all of that.
So and, what year did you come to LA?
It was 76.
Oh, okay.
And so around 78, I started getting into original music, which didn't make any money. So I had to get a job to pay the rent. Fortunately, the band that I auditioned for had a rehearsal place that was this 2-car garage that was converted into a rehearsal place in Inglewood, in this rundown, ratty apartment building that a couple of the guys in the band were living in. And there was another guy that was living in one of the upstairs apartments that had a 2-bedroom apartment, and he was a warehouse worker. And so he worked at night, and he needed a roommate. So we talked, and we seemed to get along. And so I I became his roommate, and we split the rent on a $65 a month apartment. It was just,
Oh
it was
my God.
hilarious. I didn't, so $37.50 a month was my rent for a year.
Dude,
And,
that's lunch.
Huh?
That's lunch nowadays.
Yeah. And I mean,
man.
just to tell you how broke I was, I mean, and that was $37 a month for rent, and I was eating macaroni and cheese and ramen, spending $2 a day on food. So that was pretty remarkable. And
Sure.
but once I got tired of that band, I figured I needed to get closer to Hollywood than Inglewood. So I went looking for apartments in Hollywood, and they were much more expensive than what I was paying for. So I knew I was going to have to get a better job. So I decided to try to market my questionable repair skills. I knew that I could fix stuff if I needed to. And but I had to convince other people that I could, even though I didn't know that I could until I started getting my fingers into it more.
Sure.
So I interviewed for a couple of gigs, and I didn't pass muster. And then I saw an ad for Valley Arts Guitar, and I'd heard about Valley Arts, that it was this impressive place, and this where all the it guys went to get their guitars and amps worked on, and that they were heavy. This was like the nadir, the center of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, they're not going to hire me because I don't know anything. So I didn't really have a lot of confidence. But there was another ad for another music store that was near Valley Arts, about a couple miles away, that was also looking for an in-house repair guy. So I went and applied for that job, and that guy didn't ask me any technical questions at all. He just wanted to shoot the shit with me and see if he and I would get along.
Right.
He decided that we would get along. So he hired me right on the spot. So I worked for him for about 2 weeks, and he was farther up the valley, and it was during the summer, and it was hot, and he wanted me to work on Sundays, but he wouldn't turn on the air conditioner, so it was 105 in there, and I'm like, this is stupid. So one day I got really fed up, and I went and got the recycler and looked to see if there was anything else, and the Valley Arts ad was still there. And I thought, really? They haven't found anybody, a place like that? There must be lots of guys here that could do that gig. So I went in there and applied for the job, and they asked me if I'd had any experience, and I said, well, I had my own shop in Seattle. I just made it up. I said, I had my own shop in Seattle, so I don't really have a resume because I was like self-employed. So I worked out of a little shop or out of my house, and I just did all the local amp repairs around for the Seattle musicians. And then I moved down here and started playing original music. So I really don't have anything to show you, but I'll be happy to demonstrate my skills for you. And if you like it, fine. And if you don't, fine. And they went, okay, so come tomorrow and we'll give it a try. I went, holy shit, did I just BS my way into this gig? So I went home and I told the guy in the apartment that I had moved to next to mine, who was a bass player, that I had just potentially nailed this repair job at Valley Arts. And he goes, really? That's amazing, because I took my amp over there to get it fixed, and they quoted me this outrageous amount of money, but I need to get my amp fixed, and it was an SVT. And I went, well, okay, well, let me see what I can do about that when I get there. And so when I got there, the guy who was leaving that I was replacing, it was his last week, and I said, I need something to show you guys I can do the gig. And I saw my buddy's SVT, and I said, how about that? And he goes, wow, you really like to dive in, don't you? And I said, well, I know a little bit about those. I've worked on a couple of them, which I had. I'd worked in a music store in Seattle, and I'd replaced power tubes in one time. So I knew that much. So I said, I'll give it a shot. And he says, well, there's an engineering update for it as well. And I went, what's that? I didn't say that out loud. I said, okay, what is it? And he gives me the documentation. And so the Ampeg company had issued an engineering update to change an SVT from the power tubes that they were using earlier on, from those to 6550s. Mm-hmm. And I knew a bit about 6550s, and so I knew enough about that. And from my early days in high school, I used to buy these Dynakits. We can get into that later, but these hi-fi kits, tube hi-fi amp kits. And I bought one and built it for myself, and my friends thought it was really cool, so they bought the kits, and then they paid me to build them for them. So I had experience following these step-by-step instructions, how 2 lengths of 3-inch black wired 18 gauge, and it was sure. Just like the Dynakits. It was all spelled out step by step by step. And this is great. I don't even have to know the gig. All I have to do is follow the instructions, and I'm home free. As long as I follow this, and when I turn it on, smoke doesn't come out of it, I'm golden, right? So I did all that. And I also had a little bit of skill working with power tubes because of my dad. So I was I was kind of caring about doing a neat job and drilling the holes carefully and all that, because it was somebody else's amp and I didn't want to mess it up. So I did a neat job. I followed all the instructions. I put it together and turned it on, and it all worked. And the guy who I was replacing was like, that's pretty damn good. That was impressive. And so he went down and told the boss that I had impressed him. And I did it in a normal amount of time. It didn't take me all day. I did it, and they said approximate time it takes to do this job is 1.5 hours, and I did it in an hour and a half. And he was like, okay, you know what you're doing. And then I was there 4 years, and I spent the first year of those 4 years going in at the opening time of the store and staying till closing time. So it was 9 o'clock until 9 o'clock. I didn't have to, but I stayed after hours to figure out how to do that job. And then after a year or so, repeat customers would come back and go, you did such a great job on my amp last time. I brought it back to you to do again. And then I'd get it and I open it up. I go, holy shit, this worked for 2 years? Wow. I'd wired it wrong, or it wasn't, I was like, holy shit, I escaped on this one. So I did the repair, and I fixed the part of the repair that I didn't do correctly the last time. Now that I knew a little something, I gave it back to him. He goes, man, it sounds even better than the last time I got it back from you. And I'm like, so
that's amazing.
That was an education. And then I had a lot of help in that. I had become friends with Mike Dendinelli of Mesa Boogie, who was their main tech guy. And he was like, anytime you have a question, just give me a call and I'll be happy to walk you through it. And Paul Rivera had worked there before the guy that I replaced. It was Paul, and then he was replaced by PJ Gearlings, who we're still buddies with. And so he was there for, I think, a year or something like that. And then I went in after that. And then Pete left town. He went off to work at a technology company. And Paul was around town doing the various things that he was doing, being involved in Pignose and being involved in Fender and being involved in Yamaha. So he had his fingers in all these pies. And he would come around and grab parts from me every once in a while. And I would ask him questions. And he would go, don't pay attention to the documentation. Just, you know what to do. He would say that. You know what to do. Don't get hung up on all the verbiage. And I'm like, oh, okay. I thought you had to read everything and understand everything. It's just, you know what to do. And if you have any questions, call me. So he was very cool about that. He helped me out. So whenever I had something that was out of my league as a repair, I would call one of those guys, or I learned to call the manufacturers and talk to the head technicians there. That if you were polite and paid attention when you asked them questions and they gave you answers, they would just do the job for you. All you had to do was just do the mechanical part.
That's amazing.
And so I learned to do that with Gallion Kruger and PV and everybody, because they knew they already knew what was going to break or what had broken or what the usual things that fail are. So by the time you called them, they were pretty much ready for the call. Oh yeah, you need to go here and don't take it all apart. Don't read the schematic. This isn't going to help you anyway. Just do this part. I'm like, okay. And I would do that. And then I would go back and look at the schematic, and I would understand what they were telling me to do and why. And then I would go relate back to the schematic and go, now I understand what I just did. So I learned everything by doing it completely backwards. I read the book after I did the study part, right?
Let me ask you a question.
So I had a lot of angels at my back through all of that. And two of the angels were, Mike McGuire and Al Carnes at the owners of Valley Arts, because they put up with me. And those were the years when I was touring with the Dickies and playing punk rock and, leaving town for a week or two at a time, and then, partying all night and coming to work at noon, still half smashed, and just trying to get some work done for them because it needed to get done. And man, they put up with a lot of bullshit from me, and they never fired me. I thought, today's the day they're just going to throw me out of there. Mm-hmm. But they didn't. And years later, I thanked both of them for the opportunity that led me to this. And they were both, oh, congratulations, you did great. And I always said, you guys set me up for this. So, I have you to thank, and I always remember you for that. And they're like, I'm always surprised that, why didn't you fire me when I would just come to work trashed and work for 3 hours and then leave? And they were both, we don't remember any of that. We just remember that you did a good job and that you were good with the customers and you got the work done. That's what we remember. And I'm like, really? Well, their memory was probably better than mine, but I don't know how. But that was pretty funny conversation I had with them.
Sure. Let me ask you a question. Through all those days and in all those repairs and everything, do you think that there's anything to the common, I don't know if I should say the common fear, but I'm just gonna name it that, the common thought that tube amps are somehow less reliable than like a transistor amp? You think there's anything to that?
There is nothing to that. One of the articles I wrote in Signal to Noise was about that specific subject. And I had this conversation with somebody online about it even a week or two ago. But I like to remind people that all of those ultra reliable solid state amps are in landfills, and you've still got your tube amp.
That's a funny way to look at it.
The whole thing about the new tubes aren't as good as the old ones. It's all garbage. My favorite answer to that question. So VHT started about the same time that Motley Crue started getting big, and a lot of other local bands were getting signed and starting to tour, and they were friends of mine or acquaintances, and then they became familiar with our amps and then started using them. So Crue was one of the bands that bought 2 or 3 or 4 of our power amps, classic power amps. So 8 EL34s, the supposedly most unreliable tube. And I get why people thought they were unreliable, and that was partly because the amps that people put them in, companies put them in, they weren't that well engineered. They were running pretty high plate voltages, and so they were kind of like caustic environments for tubes that, if they were operating normally, would last a really long time. So they would go tour, and then they would come back And then as they were getting ready to go do the next tour, they would bring their stuff over and go, okay, we need everything all retubed because we're going out on the next tour. And I would go, okay. So, but I wanted to have a tight relationship with them, and I didn't really want to charge them a lot of money because they'd already bought our gear, and I wanted to be able to tell everybody about it and use their name and our promotional stuff and all that. So I tried to work it out so that they didn't really have to pay much of anything for the repairs. At the time, we were using Siemens EL34s, but they were actually manufactured in Eastern Germany, East Germany, by a company called RFT. So they were branded as Siemens, they were branded as Nationals, they were branded as Telefunken, they were branded as all these different legacy brands. And they were really nice tubes. Nobody really understood where they were actually coming from, but they were pretty reliable tubes. And the way the amp was built, they weren't under a lot of strain. And because they had two of them operating at all times, they weren't even really hardly turning them up. So all these things, we're just bashing on these, we're killing these power amps. So like, no, you're not even turning them up. They're like breathing, they're not even breathing hard. And they were like, yeah, we're beating the shit out of your power amps for you. And I'm like, yeah, no, you're not. So off they go. They would come back, and I would look at all the tubes, and they were in perfect condition. So I would take the tubes out and wipe them down with a rag and some Windex to make them shiny, and I would put them back in and check them again, double check the bias, make sure they're good, and give them back to them, and they would go do the next year's tour. And then they would come back and I'd do the same thing again. And every once in a while, maybe one would go bad. After 2 or 3 years of a couple of world tours, maybe one would go bad.
Oh, that's wild.
But I had 2 boxes of tubes that I had set aside for their amps. So when they would come off the tour, I would take out the ones that they had in there, and I would put the other ones in and give it to them. And then I would take the other ones when they were gone, and I would clean them all up and double check them and put them on a burn rack and make sure that they were stable over a certain period of time and put them back in the box. And when they came around again, I'd take the ones out, put them in the box, and take those and put them back in their power. And they used those same tubes in those same amps for 20 years. I just gave them back one of them a year ago that had those same tubes in it.
That's
and
unreal.
They never, to this day, they never knew that every time they came in for a retube, they were getting their same tubes back. But I didn't charge them for them. And I never had any reliability problems with them. And that's just like a perfect example. Every time I have a discussion like this, every time, virtually the next day, somebody calls up and goes, I have a 2150 from 1992 that needs a retube. Like, okay, bring it in. And it's got the original tubes in it. It'll happen. It'll happen tomorrow. It'll happen Monday. Somebody's going to call Monday and go, hey, I got a 2150. It's going to happen. Because every time I have this conversation with somebody, that's what happens the next workday. The engineering, the design of the amplifier is what determines the reliability of the amplifier. The integrity of the design is what determines whether tubes are going to last a long time or not going to last a long time. And maintenance and vibration is the bigger killer. It's not electrical. It's not even as much about voltage. It's mostly rolling a tube amplifier around on casters on concrete, on not sidewalk concrete but street concrete, really bumpy concrete. Right. That's really what kills tubes more than anything that's going on with the design. As long as it's a decently engineered amp, there's no basis in fact for that.
All right, that's a freaking great story. So so you leave Valley Arts Guitars. What's this, about 89 or so?
Let's see. I worked at Valley Arts from 79 to 82. And then I went to work for another repair shop after that, which is called Music Tech. And I worked there from 82 to 86.
So when did VHT officially get its state paperwork?
1989.
89. So you launched VHT in 89.
Yeah,
and
so I worked at Valley.
Prior to that, you'd had your hands on everything from Fenders, high watts, you name it. Did you have like a sound in your head that you said, this is where I'm going with this?
Yeah, and it was really based on, I already had a sound that I liked, that I felt was my sort of signature sound, and that was when I was using high watts. And I had first encountered high watts at a music store in Seattle. I just thought they were cool looking. I'd gone to see Jethro Tull, and they were playing them, and they're like, I thought these were batteries made in Japan, because at the time there was a battery brand called High Watt.
Oh, funny.
And I thought, what's the relationship between these guys from England using these amps and these batteries from Japan? And there wasn't any, but I somehow thought there was. And I'd been playing drums, and I had a set of drums that I was selling, and a guy called up and said, would you take a trade? I said, what do you got? And he says, I have this 50-watt high watt head. And I'm like, oh. So he brought it over, and that was my first encounter with a high watt, except for that I'd seen it in the music store and I'd seen it on stage, and they were expensive, but they looked gorgeous. I just thought they looked so cool. And that band sounded good, and The Who certainly sounded good, so I was all into that. And so I got that 50-watt, and I just loved it, and it just did everything for me. But then I got in a band with another guitar player where we started having the volume wars, and that's when I decided, well, I need to one-up him. So I took that 50 into a music store and traded it for 100 and brought it back to the gig, and I thought, okay, this will end it. This will end it. And I turned that thing on and tried to play through it, and boy, was it a rude awakening. It wasn't just a little bit louder than the other amp. It was 3 times as powerful and as dynamic and as in your face. And I was totally unprepared for that. I just went, what the hell have I done? Sure. It was so dramatically more responsive and dynamic and unwieldy as the 50 was. I had just sort of gotten the 50 figured out. Now I had to go through that whole process again with the 100. So I had gone through all of that, and I'd learned how to tame it, and I started modifying it and stuff like that. Sliding into the gig at Valley Arts, well, the big thing that Valley Arts had going for them in the amp department was Rivera's mods. Mm-hmm. And so people were still sending their stuff from around the country to Valley Arts to get modified, to get Rivera mods done. Only Rivera was doing his other stuff, and plus he was doing some mods on the side for people. But there would be guys that would send us stuff, and I had some of the documentation, and so I tried a couple of them for some customers. And Paul calls up and he goes, "Hey Stevie, are you doing my mods?" And I'm going, "Yeah, the documentation is here." Answer for that. Is there something else I can't help with? I said, I'm not supposed to do that? And he goes, no. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. All right. I won't do them anymore then. He goes, okay, thanks. And he hung up, and I went, yeah, Paul's really helpful, and I don't want to step on his toes, and I didn't realize he felt that way about it. So, okay. But people are asking me to do stuff, so maybe I'll figure out some of my own. But that's where I came up. That's where I got introduced to the idea of modifying amps. I didn't really, outside of putting in a master volume or tinkering with amps, I didn't understand that there was like a fledgling industry of it. And that's kind of where I really started to get into that, which eventually led to building something. So the high watt thing was the foundation first, because that was my core sound, and I just needed it to do these other things that it didn't do. But Marshall didn't do it either, and nothing else did it. And So yeah, I had a sound in my head, and I wanted to establish that and flesh that out and make it happen.
Right.
And I tried to avoid doing it myself because that pull of electronics. If I knew that if I get sucked into that, I would get pulled away from the music and I would
Right.
get lost. And that was already starting to happen at Valley Arts.
Sure.
So that's why I ended up showing up at work at noon with a hangover, because I was still struggling doing original music and playing shows and doing all that stuff, and leaving town for a couple of days and then having to come back and then play catch up and all that. And it was a real conflict, but I had to get over that.
Right.
And so for that reason, I was determined that I was not going to start my own company or build my own amps. Rivera offered me 3 different jobs. He offered, when he went to Pignose, he offered me a job as a line tech. When he went to Fender, he offered me a job in the engineering design department. And when he started his own company, he offered me a job. And I turned him down every time. And he's like, why do you keep turning me down? And I said, it's not you. I really appreciate the opportunity, but I don't want to do this for a living. And Randall Smith, I had the same conversation with. I don't want to do this for a living. And then, so when I came to the NAMM show with this 2150 power amp that had become this accidental hit, Rivera and Mike Bendinelli come to me with, what was all this bullshit about you don't want to do your own amp? And I'm like, I didn't. I made a prototype and everybody wanted it. And then so they gave me money. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah. Oh, that's wild.
So
That's wild.
I was embarrassed. I was apologizing to both of those guys for, Randall Smith is going, all of our customers tell us don't put a presence control or any other tone controls in the front of the amplifier. They don't want that. And here you come along and do that, and you knock a big hole in our power amp business. And I'm like, sorry. It was really intimidating and kind of comical at the same time. But yeah, so and the same thing happened with the amps. I developed this amp knowing that I didn't really want to do it. When I heard about Mike Soldano, I was like, oh, this guy's making a name for himself. So I went down to his shop and struck up a conversation with him. We're still friends to this day. And I said, let's check it out. So I checked it out and I went, oh, yeah, pretty nice. Can I take it to a rehearsal and try it out? I'll give you my credit card or whatever. He goes, yeah, just take it. So I took it to rehearsal, and it was really good, but it wasn't it.
Wasn't your sound.
It was, and I was really disappointed because I so wanted him to take that off of my shoulders, that I wanted him to take that monkey off my back from me. I was just like, you could do this. I opened it up and looked inside. It wasn't that sophisticated. I thought, you could do this. And I talked to him about it. And he's like, yeah, I kind of do what I do. And I went, yeah, I had a feeling you were going to say that. So I gave him back his amp, and I trudged back to my shop, and I went, okay, I'm going to have to do this myself. When Rivera's rack mount TBR head came out, the first one, highly anticipated, everybody's like playing through it, and all the major guys were checking it out and starting to tour with it and stuff. And I went, well, this will be it. I played that and like, Paul, I love you, and it's got all these things that it does well, but it's not my thing. Randall Smith was coming out with the Mark II. We had phone calls back and forth every week because the transition from the Mark I to the Mark II was really strenuous, and people were not understanding what they were getting, and at the same time, they were getting feedback really quickly back from their buyers that had bought Mark IIs that were expecting Mark Is. And they were like, it's doing this. It's popping when you switch channels. It doesn't have the right kind of gain. It doesn't sound like the other guy in my band has. It doesn't sound like that. That's what I thought I was getting. And they're scrambling to try to reconcile all this stuff. And I'm the main Mesa Boogie repair shop in Southern California, so we're on the phone every day and with Benelli and with Randall, and like, so what are you hearing from this, and what are you hearing about that, and what kind of feedback are you getting, and what do you think is, what do you personally think, and blah blah blah. And so after a little bit of that, Randall called me and he says, hey, look, I'll send you a Mark II, one of the newer versions of the Mark II. I'll give you like a killer nothing price on it. And I said, thanks, I appreciate that. I said, but I have what I like already. And he says, what do you have? And I said, well, I have this high watt. And he goes, oh, you're one of those guys. And I said, what do you mean? He says, those British tubes, those EL34s, you're one of those. And I went, oh, well, I don't exactly know what that means, but yeah, I'm pretty tied into. I've been using it a long time, and there is a certain thing I like about it that I said. I know I work here at Valley Arts, and I work with all these clients of yours that appreciate these, and I can see why. And I get all of that. It's just not my thing. And he's like, he was a little miffed at first, but he was like, okay, all right, well, hey, that's cool. I didn't denigrate his stuff. I just said it's just not my thing. I like this. So again, it just goes back to I kept resisting this thing, and everybody thought that I was just putting up this big front. I was secretly doing all this R&D and taking their shit apart and figuring out how to copy it and how to make their thing, and make money off of it. But I was not. I was doing the opposite. I was looking at what they were doing to understand what I didn't want my amp to do and sound like.
That's wild.
And I discovered how they behaved and how their stuff worked as a result of that, going back to my not being afraid to take stuff apart and find out what made them tick, so that
sure,
I didn't want to go down that road. But these are guys that are actually going out and they're the next generation. Right. After Leo Fender, they're figuring it out. They're figuring their way out. And I used what I learned from their experience to figure my way through it when I realized that I was getting pretty fed up with music at the time. The music side of my personality was losing the battle. I was getting bored with it. I was getting frustrated with it. It was going nowhere. The industry was starting to really suck. And I just thought, okay, the music guy is going to go to sleep, and the electronics guy is going to wake up, and he's going to take over that half of the brain for a while. And that one thing led to another, And what I had done was I had built my amp that was going to be my amp. Mm-hmm. And so since people were going around and making money doing that, I thought, well, I can possibly make money doing this. I'll take this around and see what people think of it. So I took that amp to Valley Arts, and I took it to a couple of places, and I took it to Andy Brower's studio rentals, because he was the guy that was interacting with a lot of artist guys. And I was not working at the repair shop anymore because I couldn't do music and tinker and repair. All that was just too much.
Understood.
So I took this prototype around, and Lon Cohen, who was a guy that was a dispatcher at Valley Arts, and not at Andy Brower, I set up an appointment with him to meet with Andy, and I had done repairs for Andy because he had the cartridge company, and he brought in Eddie's amps and Lukather's amps and stuff. So I did all the repair work that he did for his clients. I was actually doing that repair work for him, for them.
Oh, that's funny.
So I worked on all that stuff. I worked on Dwayne Eddy's gear, and I worked on Carlson's gear, and God, just too many names.
Sure.
To even remember them all. But I saw a lot of gear, and I worked with a lot of artists that were very, very cool people, and they were really generous with their thoughts and ideas and their encouragement, and very specific about what they liked and they didn't like, and all these kinds of things that I learned from. So I took this over to Andy and I played it for him. And he's like, this is great, blah, 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 blah. And Lon, as I'm leaving, Lon says, that's pretty cool, but if you made a power amp of the power amp section of that head, that might be something. And I thought, why? And he says, well, because all these guys are starting to build racks now. And I had been, when I was at Valley Arts, I worked with Buzzy Featon, and he was like one of the first guys that was combining stuff in a box, different things. Right. And he was really curious and a real pioneer in experimenting with jamming different pieces and odds and ends together. So I was already familiar with the rack thing, and I'd already made myself a little preamp, and I'd already tried some stuff. So I was kind of familiar with the concept, but Bradshaw was already in the game, and Soldano already had a preamp, and they're starting to, and Brower is starting to be like the center of putting these things together. And, and Bradshaw was doing it, and they were starting to use these H&H solid state power amps. And Lon was the guy that heard the sound of it and went, that could be a pretty cool sound for a power amp. And I'm like, So I went back, and over the following weekend, I went to the surplus electronics store and scrambled and grabbed a bunch of parts and stuff and started cobbling bits and pieces together. And when I had worked for Music Tech, the repair shop, they had been doing transformer swaps in gray market keyboards coming from Japan. Because the currency exchange was radical. So DX7s and all the keyboards that were coming in and selling like hotcakes were getting gray marketed in by all these guys that could fly to Japan, buy 20 DX7s for less than the distributor was charging the dealer, and bring them back here and just get the voltage changed on them and sell them and make good money on it. So the gray market and black market for this bootleg keyboard business was, Music Tech was just drowning in it. Right. So there was a transformer builder, a transformers manufacturer in the Valley that the owner of the repair shop went, hey, can you take this little transformer and can you make me a 120 volt version of this? So they gave him the transformer. He said, oh yeah, that's easy. So he made a couple 100 transformers, and we had our own transformer suppliers. So we were just doing the voltage conversion there. That's how I got hooked up with the transformer suppliers. So I went, hey, I need a transformer like this. And I scribbled some stuff down on a piece of paper. And the guy's dad, who was just about to retire, was the real engineer. And he had tube chops. And he's like, yeah, I think I know what you're trying to accomplish here. And you might want to do this instead of that. And I'm like, oh, whatever. So he made me some transformers. He made me a couple of output transformers and a power transformer. And within a week, I had this thing all cobbled together. And I took it over there, and I took it to Valley Arts, and I took it back to Brower, and Brower had just started working out a deal with Greg Bales, who was the original owner of Making Music in Chicago. And Bales said, how long would it take you to make a production version of 10 of those? I said, I don't know. Well, I'm not really a manufacturer. I've never done it before. So all I know is that I got this far, and I don't know how much money it would take to go any farther. I don't even know if I want to do it. I was still in that stage. And, well, how much money do you think you would need to just like go buy all the parts and just build 10 of them? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Let me go figure it out. So I had to spend a week calling suppliers, figuring out how to be a buyer. Now, I had a little bit of purchasing experience by being at Valley Arts and buying tubes and parts, resistors, capacitors for repairs. So I knew who some of the parts distributors were, and I did have some purchasing chops. So I just expanded that to, you know, switches and knobs and all the other little things. And so I made a list and figured kind of roughly how much it would cost to do all that. And I went back to him and I said, I think I'll need about $7,000 to start, and about another 5, 7 to 10 maybe when they're all done to deliver them. And he goes, okay, and he hands me a check for $7,000. I'm like,
no kidding.
I met you a week ago. He goes, oh, well, you know Andy. He says you're cool. So I'm like, oh, okay. So
Amazing.
I went and I bought all the parts, and I worked with a sheet metal supplier, learned how to do mechanical drawings the same way I learned how to do everything else, by doing it all the wrong way first. The first chassis for the first 20 power amplifiers, the way I had done the drawings, you could read them two ways. They formed those chassis backwards. They had all the hardware in the right place, but they were backwards and upside down. It just so happened the way the chassis were built and the way the circuit boards were done, that when you put them together, you could put them together. I just had to make them, wire them inside a mirror image of the way they were supposed to be made. So the first 2150 power amplifiers, you can open it up and set it upside down with the electronics exposed and take the 21st one and put it next to it. And they're mirror images of each other because the next 20 were made properly.
No shit.
So
that's
they
wild.
look exactly like the same amp, but one of them is the reverse of the other one. And I went, I have to deliver to these guys. I can't wait for another 6, 8 weeks for you to make the chassis again. The guy's like, what are we going to do? And I went, let me just see. So I took one and I built it backwards, and I went, oh, problem solved. We'll just make them backwards. So we made them backwards. We made the first 20 backwards.
Huh.
And I got them to them, and they put them in a few people's rigs that went out on tour, and they sailed right out. And the next thing I know, my phone is ringing in my apartment. I'd been up all night tweaking and twiddling and goofing around with stuff in my apartment, and I finally got to sleep at noon. Just as I'm falling asleep, I'm out, and the phone rings, and it's a guy from Tokyo going, are you the guy that makes those power amps? Like, yeah, can you call me back in a couple hours? I just went to sleep. He says, I'm calling from Tokyo. And I'm like, I said, hold on a second. And I go into the bathroom and I splash cold water on my face and get a pen and a piece of paper. And I like, okay, who are you? He says, oh, well, we sell music gear here in Japan, and your power amps are like the hot new thing. And like, how do I buy them from you? And I'm so, so in the space of 1 year, I learned circuit board design, chassis fabrication, purchasing, production planning, production QC, setting up accounts with suppliers,
sure.
And all, man, I just learned it all. I learned all of that in that first year. It just like I never, and graphic design,
right?
Came up with the VHT logo, all of that stuff. I was so busy and so wrapped up into it, I didn't even have time to stop and think, you really think you're going to pull this off? I never even had time to think about it. It just was, it just, everything had to be done, and that was all that crept into my mind.
Were those first 20 that you released, were those all like point to point, or did you have PC boards printed?
I had a little of both. I had PC boards made for supporting all of the resistors and capacitors and all of that.
Sure.
And then the pots and the sockets were wired to the circuit boards. And the only reason I did it that way is because at the time they were single-sided circuit boards, and I didn't think that they would support the sockets very well electronically. And this is where my repair experience came in, because I was able to remember the way certain tube amplifiers were built and how they failed. And like, okay, well, I don't want to do it that way. And I knew that I was inexperienced enough to know that I shouldn't do any risky sort of design elements, because I don't know what the outcome is going to be. But I do know what happens when a poorly engineered circuit board has tube sockets on it. Mm. Now, the fact that we have been doing PC-mounted power tube sockets since 1991, I mean, that's kind of like a big bragging thing for us, because they are so reliable, and they have always been so reliable. Yeah. And I never really wanted to spend all that time agonizing over all those little wires and things. That was really my thing. The challenge for me, the thing for me was the challenge. And the challenge was to get them built, make them reliable, and sell them, and then do it again, and then sell them, and then do it again. That was really what I understood to be the goal. They need to be fantastic looking on the outside. They need to be bulletproof for touring, and they need to be producible by however we're going to produce them. And I hired some assembly guys. It wasn't really my intention to do that and to be the wire sculpture artiste. That wasn't ever my thing, because I didn't see any practical application for that other than just what it ultimately become, point to point and hand wired, and they all became sort of buzzwords. And all those buzzwords, I just have a thing about buzzwords, like tube amp guru, like X pattern, class A versus class AB, and all these new old stock, almost new old stock, or all of those things. They're just like red ants at a picnic for me. They're just like, the goal is reliability. The goal is to make it producible, make it easy to service, make it clean. When you look inside, I want people to open our amp and look inside and forget about whether it's hand wired or PCB wired, and just appreciate it on the engineering quality that's in there, and just, we did it the way we think that it's as right as we can make it. Yeah. And if you have a problem with that, well, that's okay. You're not a customer? Well, fine.
I think out there's a lot of guys that, outside of the manufacturing side of the business, of course, the players out there, who are quite taken, quite smitten with the buzzwords. Being that I'm in sales, I hear it every single day when people ask those same questions. And I've long heard that your perspective on the matter is that you are very pro PC board. You think it's just as good, if not better, than hand wired or whatever. What's your official take on that, so I'm not putting words in your mouth?
Okay. First of all, one quick little story. We got one of our amps in for repair, an old one from 92, that was just butchered inside. All the wires inside were all over the place. When it was originally built, the wires are all neatly laid out. Most of the wiring you don't even see. It's tucked underneath the circuit boards. So you basically see these boards and a little bit of AC wiring and some jumpers here and there. But for the most part, it's just this clean scene in there. You can eat off of the inside of these things. But this one, somebody had taken the circuit boards out and put them back in, and just the wires were a rat's nest. It was a mess. I took a picture of it and I put it on our Facebook page to show what a horrible butchery had been exacted on this poor amplifier. And all the comments were, awesome wiring. Man, so you're getting into point-to-point now? Now it just totally blew up in my face. This was last year. This wasn't an old story. This was last year.
That's funny.
I was
not the expected result.
So we rebuilt the amp and put it all back to stock, and then I did another Facebook page. For all you guys that thought that was so hot looking, this is what it was supposed to look like. And the response was, "Yay, you did a great job on that." It was just like, it was almost like I felt like we could have just poured cement in it, taken a picture of that, and we would have got just as many good comments, you know.
That's too bad, but it's true. I get it. So 90
to answer your question.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And this is the standard answer that any quality circuit, even not necessarily quality, but mostly quality circuit board amplifier manufacturers will say, which is that the consistency is superior. Everyone is built with the same distances between components. The virtual wires, which are the copper traces on the circuit board, are in exactly the same position on every single amplifier. And when you play 10 Deliverance 120 heads, except for maybe some minor variations in the tubes, they're all going to sound the same, and the knobs are going to be pretty much, you know, land in the same positions, and you can pretty much count on that. Whereas amps that are point-to-point wired, or even amps that have some circuit board and wire bundles in them, like a lot of the 70s and 80s Marshalls had, all sound different. They all sound different, every single one. You could play 5 of them. They're like guitars. You could play 5 of them, and one of them is amazing, and then another one is a piece of crap, and they all came out of the same factory the same day. But one of them sounds great, and one of them sounds awful. And the only thing that changed is just the relationship of the different wires bundled, or the relationship of components to other components. So circuit boards lock all that down. And the beauty of designing the circuit boards is I get an opportunity to determine how much interaction I want between two adjacent components. They're spaced a certain way for a reason, and they're going to stay spaced that way. And it produces a sonic quality. Now, we'll design another amplifier with the same basic circuit topology, but the components will be arranged differently. And that amp will sound completely different than the other one. It has its own qualities and its own reason to exist, but it has some different personality quirks in it because the components are arranged differently on the circuit board. So, for example, on the Sound City amps, what I did on those was I took the original David Rees designed Sound City, which was very similar in layout to the early high watts, and I laid out all the components on the circuit board with the same distance spacing relationships that were used in the point-to-point wiring of those amplifiers, and then the critical wiring, which is just the power supply wiring, and the signals from the preamp area to the power amp area are not of great consequence in that amp. It's the relationship of the components on the turret boards in the high watts that sort of establish that they sound a certain way. Not to mention the transformers and the other things, but really it's the relationships of the components. So I copied that whole relationship and just laid the circuit boards out that way.
Sure.
And of course, the Sound City design is a little different than the high watt, so it behaves a little different than the high watt, but it's got that same sort of sonic quality, the signature and stuff, and it's all circuit board, and it's bulletproof, and it's quiet. It's much quieter than the original high watts. It's much quieter than the original Sound Cities because I'm able to take advantage of the circuit board technology and a couple of other little tricks to eliminate the filament string interacting with the signal carrying wires and all of that, and controlling the ground plane. It just gives you so much control and so much consistency. And when people hear this amp that basically a very similar layout to a high watt and put them side by side. The high watt hisses and hums, and the Sound City really hisses and hums. And the new Sound City is quiet as a mouse, and you don't even realize how loud it is until you play a chord and knocks your head off and like, wait a minute, that's so quiet. How did you do that? We designed out the noise by using what the circuit board allows us to accomplish with regard to, those little things. It's not so much about the tone. It's like all the other little weird artifacts that come along with it that you get to eliminate. So that is really all, to me, secondary. Like you said, there's people out there that just they just obsess about all of that. And that's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. To me, the most important thing is making a reliable amplifier and getting it out there so people can play it, and then making another one the same way, and then another one the same way. And when people come and go, people come to, they want to get a different job and they leave and they go to a different place and you have to hire somebody else. And here's how you do it. Here's the circuit board sample. You put the parts on this way, or whoever puts those circuit board parts on the board, you can only do it one way. So it just locks in the consistency, and it means that I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we make an amp. Now we make one amplifier that is truly point-to-point wired, the ether. And I did that just partly for fun, partly to do something really, really different in that realm than anybody else does. This is a different incarnation of a vintagey style tube amplifier. I felt like this is what I would do if I was an engineer in 1946. If I was Leo starting out at that time, this is probably what would come out of my head. That's what the ether was about. So I did it all point to point, and we did this mid-late 1940s visual treatment on it. But we put the preamp and the power amp separate in little two pieces and plugged them together with these complicated connectors, just like you would see on old military equipment. It was completely on a lark, but I did it all point to point to make a point, and that was that when you listen to it, you don't hear an old Fender, you don't hear an old Marshall, you don't hear an old High Watt or anything or an old Vox. You hear a unique amplifier experience, and the reason is because that's how I envisioned it, the sound. And I made it look unique so that you wouldn't try to glom onto the visual cues and pre-establish in your mind what you thought it was going to sound like. My friend Saul Cole Guitars, he said, what I really liked about my first encounter with this amplifier was I couldn't tell what I was preconceived. I couldn't prejudge what I was going to expect to hear because of the way it looked and the way you put it together and all that. I didn't have any preconception about how it was going to sound. So when I played it, it was a completely fresh experience. And that was like, I was like, yeah, that's exactly right.
That's awesome. So it's got your own personality built into it.
Yeah, so
something different.
It completely disrupts the whole concept that, the point-to-point thing, it imparts all these sort of vintage qualities. Well, what vintage qualities are going on in the ether that you can identify? And people would come in and play it, and they'd be like, yeah, it's kind of like a JTM meets a 5G6, blah, 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 blah. And they're just doing that same thing of I understand what they're doing. They're trying to wrap their mind around it in a way that they understand. And it's just my pull the rug out from your personality to do everything I can to break you of that habit so that you come away with a fresh experience, with a fresh perspective, and really hear what we're trying to get across rather than have your opinion already preformed before you even get a chance to start.
Right. Let me ask you this, because it ties into what we're talking about with being inventive and doing something different. And I want to bring it up because you're one of the only guys that I've seen do this in the past. You and Mesa Boogie pretty much are the only guys that I've ever seen that will include an active preamp on your amplifier. the Pitbull series on occasion will have the 5-band graphic, right? How come we never see amplifiers? I mean, I guess it could be marketability, it could be whatever, but why do we never see an amplifier that has an active EQ circuit or a partial parametric or even a full parametric EQ? It seems like you could get a lot of voicing changes out of an amp if you had like a sweepable mid, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Any ideas, or why do you think we don't see that out there?
I think it's end user bias. In fact, I'm sure it's end user bias.
Really?
There was a time when that didn't exist. When Rivera was at Yamaha, they produced probably what was arguably their most popular guitar amplifier, the G100 112. A 100-watt, solid state, basically Princeton,
Mm-hmm.
or deluxe, and I think it had all of Paul's vision about what his mods are bringing to the table with the amp. You jack up the gain and you jack up the mids to get that ultimate sustain and that cocked wah sound and all that kind of stuff. But on a Fender platform with a reliable speaker that'll hold up and a nice reverb and an effects loop, and it's portable. And at that time, that's why everybody was buying deluxes, because they're like these, the A-list session guys that are doing 4, 5, 6 dates a day, and then a gig at night, and lightweight on the go, does a lot of different things well, blah, 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 gets specific sound, and so on and so on. So he took all of that and poured it into this, I think, my impression is that he poured all of that into this amplifier, which was a solid state 100-watt amp with a good speaker and reverb and a clean sound and a distortion sound, and it had a sweepable parametric in it, just like you described. A sweepable mid. There was 2 knobs. One was the intensity and the other one was the Q. And so you could form basically what was his 5-position fat switch on the old Rivera Deluxe Reverb mod, or the Fender mod, which was just turning up, stepping up the mids more and more. That amp was wildly successful, and they sold a lot of them. And then they just changed the design to something else, and it just went away. And everybody's like, why did you stop making that amp? Oh, well, we made something better, and it didn't look as cool, and it didn't sound as cool, and he was gone by then, and it just kind of erased all of the mileage that they'd gotten out of the G100. But there was a lot more willingness in those days by players who were just exploring everything. There was a lot more exploration. There was a lot more. There wasn't all these preconceived notions about what a guitar amp was supposed to be, because those notions were all being formed then, and the big amps that had sort of ruled the roost were taking a way back seat to little amps that were doing all these innovative things like Mesas, and they were powerful, but they were small, and they had overdrive, and you didn't necessarily have to use a pedal with them, but you could, and they were portable, and they were built well, and they just had all these qualities, and the idea of them was that there was a quality and that there was a unique reason to have this thing, and so the name artists that used them opened up the way for them. But the EQ thing with Mesa, I'm not exactly sure what their impulse there was, other than I think just to make it more versatile, because they were trying to figure out ways to make the amp more versatile in that little package. Because they were just unbelievably mid-focused amplifiers. And that was the trick in getting in the early stages of high gain amplifier development, was that when you ramp up the mids, they sustain better. And too much treble and too much bass sounds tubby and fizzy, right? So they rolled off the top and they rolled off the bottom and they jacked up the mids and they jacked up the gain, and that's how they got lots and lots of sustain and lots of and distortion that sounded, like liquid, like the violin sound, because the top and the bottom is pretty much lopped off. So and then you used a high efficiency speaker to try to bring some of the top and bottom back, but they're stiff speakers. So there's all these little compromises you have to make to jam all that into a little package with a hardwood cab that looks beautiful, but it's a very stiff cab and brittle. And so you could start to see how the EQ comes in handy to sort of to take out some of the salt and add some of the pepper.
Understood.
For the individual to fine tune it to their particular application. So I think that was the impulse for that. When we came out with our first heads, we had 412 cabinets, and then everybody started asking for combos. So to have a 100-watt multi-channel head in a combo that sounded like a half stack was a really tall order. And in order to get it to sound good for clean with reverb, it needed to be open back to have that open ambient sound. But for overdrive, you needed to do other things. You needed to voice the thing so that it sounded good in the same cabinet with the same speakers for overdrive. That's a tall order. Because in an open back cab, here's the thing about 412 cabs. 4 25-watt speakers in a 412 cab is a 100-watt cab. But in a sealed 100-watt cab, you can actually pound the speakers harder because they're in a sealed enclosure. That sealed column of air restricts the movement of the cone. So it's harder to blow then. You put those same 4 speakers in that same cab with the back off and play the same volume, all 4 of them will blow within an hour.
Oh, wow.
So in a 212 open back combo, now you have half the speakers. You need 3 times the power handling capacity, because it can't be 100 watts worth of speakers. It has to be 200 or 300 watts worth of speakers because it's an open back cab. And it's still a 100-watt amp that can really slam those speakers around. So you have to use higher power speakers that have stiffer suspension, and they don't sound as good as the lower power speakers and more of them in a bigger cab. But you're trying to make it as portable as you can make it, a 75-pound 212 100-watt amp. So that's why I decided to go with the EQ. It's a totally different reason than for Mesa to do it. And so my goal was to be able to use the EQ to be able to voice the amp so that it sounded more like it had lower power speakers in it. Duck out some of the mids, duck down some of the top and bottom. And by reducing some of the low end thump, there would be less excursion on the speakers, so you're less likely to blow it.
Right.
And so that was the main reason for the existence of the EQ, was for the 212 combo.
Right.
And
interesting.
It's just really funny about. It's a great question, because the evolution of those electronics are not what you think they are. They started out as one thing, but they became popular for an entirely other reason. With Mesa, then Metallica comes along, and just as a lark, somebody goes along and they just take all the mids out, and there's the Metallica sound. They pulled out all of that really overdone mid-range out of the Mark II and make it sound really wide and open. It's like, oh, that's what you use an EQ for. So, okay, along comes VHT. We've got a 6-band graphic EQ. I did 6 bands because Mesa did 5, and I got to do everything different than everybody else.
Of course.
So, it's almost like the Mesa one makes more sense, because the frequency that you really got to get rid of is the middle one. So with 5 bands, the middle one is right in the middle. So it with ours, if you want to pull out the mids, you got to pull 2 of them down, but not as far, because you don't need to take out as much.
Right.
But because it was an EQ and because it was in a guitar amp that had high gain, people would just automatically make a V shape out of our EQ, even though it wasn't necessary, because our amps already had a more open feel anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the other thing was, at the time, we only offered it in the combo, and people started asking for it in the head, which I didn't think made any sense. Why do you need to do that? You use a 412 cab, you got everything you need. What the hell you need an EQ in that for? Our dealers and distributors were saying, well, we want that option in our heads, because if you have that option, then we want to be able to offer the fully loaded model that you make. Right. I said, yeah, but we don't make that model of a head with the EQ in it. Yeah, well, you should put that option. I said, but it's not an option. It's only a feature on that model. Just like on a certain car, only that model comes with a 6-speed transmission. The other ones don't. Well, no, they should all be available with the option of 6-speed. Or like, oh God, what have I done? So
yeah, that's the old fallacy that everything you can do is a good thing.
Yes, and so it was like, well, money talks, you know.
Right.
We'll give you an order for 10 Ultra Leads if you make it available with the 6-band graphic in it. Okay, so we put it in there, and exactly what I was afraid would happen. It's just, yeah, this thing is like really boomy and really bright. How do you have the EQ set? Well, you know, like the normal way. What's the normal way? Like this. Like, okay, put all the sliders flat, and then just duck this one down a little bit, push that one up a little bit, just one knot each, and tell me what you think. Oh yeah, that fixed it. And
yeah, of course.
And to this day, we have that conversation. But now it's become a thing. The Fryette EQ has got its own sort of reason to exist, just like the Mesa one does, for different reasons. But everybody now knows that our EQ behaves a lot differently than a Mesa. It's in our amps, which behave a lot different than Mesas, and so that whole stew is a thing of its own, and it's valid. So now we're kind of like taking advantage of it and going, okay, well, the value of that is almost more in the marketing, the fact that it's there as opposed to not there. But sure, again, because it is a really good EQ. And what makes a good EQ? Well, I had a specific thing in mind when I was designing the EQ, and what it was like I said, to make the combo behave the way I would want a big amp to behave, but also the EQ points are selected based on speaker behavior and guitar body behavior.
Sure.
So what we did was we took, I don't know if you can see it here, there's this stereo 16-band EQ. I had a big EQ like that. It was actually a 26-band EQ. And I took that and put it in the effects loop of our amps, and I took a Telecaster and a Strat and a Les Paul and a couple other guitars, and we played the guitars through the amp and turned every single band up and down to see how it affected the sound of the guitar. And I discovered that there was certain things like the way the body sounds, the way the neck sounds, the way the hardware sounds, the headstock and the strings and the nut, and just like all around the body, they have these characteristic little resonances. Not just the body wood itself, but the characteristic of the bridge and the characteristic of the pickup. They all have these sort of little idiosyncrasies all around the guitar. So I started thinking that, what would be cool for the EQ would be to try to zero in on the different, enhanced characteristics of the different guitars so that you can dial those and that would make the EQ more useful because it's not just some random frequency. It's the frequency at which a Strat in a high gain amp is really annoying, and you want to be able to pull that down, or that you want to bring up in a Telecaster to give it more of that twangy vibe and all that. So I identified 6 frequencies that are in common with a lot of guitars that those resonances can be enhanced or suppressed a little bit to sort of dial the amp into the different guitars that you use. And one of the key things about our amps that I've always tried to accomplish was that our amps don't make all your guitars sound the same. They make your guitars sound like each different guitar that you bought for a reason that you like, for the reason you like that guitar. When you plug it into our amp, regardless of whether you set it clean or highly overdriven or whatever, it doesn't make all your guitars sound the same. It makes them sound uniquely different, which is why you have them. And there are amps out there that have so much gain and so many of the frequencies modified or lopped off to compensate for all the excessive gain and the excessive fizz and the excessive thump and all that it tends to squish out the personality of the guitars. That gets lost. Right. So that was kind of a revelation to me. So we went through all those 26 bands and picked 6. And then we played with, you mentioned the sweepable and the Q and all that. I figured that was going to make the EQ too complicated by having a knob to adjust those things.
Right.
Because I realized later on that we were designing way over players' heads a lot of times. And so we have to spend a lot of time explaining to them the philosophy behind that and just having, a deer in the headlights kind of attitude.
Sure.
Because it is complex. I understand it. Our people understand it. Some players understand it, but a lot of people, it's pretty deep. So
yeah, halfway through the conversation, the first thing that you said really rang true. Because the first thing you said was user bias.
Yeah.
And then halfway through the conversation, when you started saying, oh, my amp sounds terrible because I've got a V-shaped EQ, that's when I realized right there, you're probably right not to include it. Amp builders are probably right not to include all this extra stuff because you are going to have people out there who are going to say, boy, this thing sounds terrible. Yeah. Because they've dialed it to sound terrible.
Yeah. So rather than do that, after we picked the frequencies, we picked the bandwidth of each frequency.
Right.
So that like the higher frequencies wouldn't be too obtrusive, they have a narrower bandwidth. And the lower frequencies where it's not so apparent what they're bringing out of the wood of the guitar, you need to have it a little broader and have the different bands overlap so that they sort of help each other. So this EQ is really unique in that as it goes from low frequencies to high frequencies, the bandwidth shrinks and the overlap between bands shrinks, so that the top frequencies that you adjust are more subtle. They do the job, but they're not. It's not so easy to overdo it. Where in the lower registers, where you want to overdo it a little bit, it's easier to do because of the shape of each band. And nevertheless, at one NAMM show, we heard this really horrendous sound coming out of our sound booth, and there was a guy in there who was playing through an ultra lead, and he had the treble and the bass of the overdrive channel all the way up, the mid-range all the way down, and the graphic set up V-shaped. And we're like, wow. So, and
it's your curse.
It's all in the groin and in the forehead, and there's nothing in between.
That's fun.
And he's like, this sounds badass. I never heard this amp before. This sounds badass. And I'm like, keep playing. So he kept playing, and I turned the treble and the bass down, and I gradually turned the mids up, and I gradually leveled out the EQ a little bit, just slowly while he's playing. And then after about 10 minutes, he goes, that sounds amazing. What did you do? And that's just the story of my life.
I'm guessing that much like the subtlety of that EQ, that player was probably not the most subtle of guys. I'm imagining that the playing was just show metal.
Yeah, and it was the EQ was a little touchier before we sort of I sort of trimmed that back a little bit so that you could move them more, because people just want to move them more, whether or not you need it. They just want to be able to do that. but back to user bias, people also want to set. They don't necessarily try to set the amp, dial the amp into where it sounds best. They try to set the knobs where they're used to setting them.
Sure.
And so if they've been playing a certain amp all their life and they've put the treble here and the middle here and the bass there, every amp, that's the way you should set it. And there was a gear page discussion going on one time where some guy was just like, those Fryettes are just so mid-range heavy. They're so obnoxious. Why can't they do something about those mids? And one guy pops in and goes, perhaps you should try turning the mid control down like 3 or 4 notches. And the guy comes back about an hour later and goes, holy crap, that sounds great.
So he never tried it.
That's never even tried it, because they don't, it's not an indictment of them necessarily. They're just, people are creatures of habit. And it doesn't always enter your consciousness that what middle really means. It's just to some people, it's just a knob that you set.
Right.
And they're not idiots. Steve Lukather is renowned for it's just, you just set a certain way. John Lennon would brag about he barely knows how to set up an answering machine, let alone play a guitar. Some people didn't really get that. We
Sure.
loaned a Memphis. You mentioned the Memphis amp. We loaned a Memphis to Lukather, and he took it to a session. He goes, "This thing is just noisy, and it's just humming, and it's hissing, and the tubes are microphonic. And what's the deal with this amp?" And I went, "What the hell just happened?" So we went over to the studio, and it's like everything is full right-hand sweep in the overdrive channel. So the gain is all the way up, the master's all the way up, treble, middle, bass all the way up, reverb all the way up, presence all the way up. And I looked at it, and he says, "Yeah, listen to this." And he plugs it in, plays it. He goes, "What's up with that?" And I said, "You set it to sound like that. That's what's supposed to sound like, set like that." So I went like this, and he goes, "Oh, that sounds really good." And it's people are just sort of have a habit of doing that. I was playing a gig. A guy asked me to do a show at the last minute. They flew into town. They didn't have any gear. They got to the gig. I brought my own gear to the rig, and the singer, who was the rhythm guitar player, just plays whatever happens to be laying around. So the band that opened for them said, "Hey, yeah, you can use my amp." And so he plugs in, and he's like tweaking around with the knobs, and he's just like looks at me, "Hey, Stevie, can you help me get a sound out of this thing? I can't figure out what to do." And I looked at it, and I played a chord, and I handed it back, played that same chord, and I just went, and I just turned the volume all the way up, and he played a chord, and he goes, "That did it." And we did the set that way. And then the opening band, the guitar player that owned the amp, came up to me, and he goes, "I just couldn't believe when I heard that you were the owner of this company. I've always admired your gear, and I'm sorry that you had to deal with my amp, my funky little amp." And I go, "Your amp sounds great. What are you talking about?" He goes, "Well, I've never heard anybody get a sound out of it like you did." And I wanted to get back to, I had one day to learn 7 songs, and I wanted to just get my head back into remembering the bits and pieces that I have to remember. And I just fuck, just turn it up and just be done with it. You're playing rhythm guitar anyway. But he was just like, "Oh, you saved the day." And I'm like, I was just trying to get the guy out of my hair.
Oh, that's funny. You've got other technical accomplishments that maybe you don't get as recognized for as you should. Am I understanding correctly that you're the first guy that did like the depth control thing or the resonance control or whatever it is?
I created that control. Yeah.
That's awesome. And you also have something right now that's kind of like blowing my mind, and especially sitting here and seeing your screen, or I should say seeing your workshop on my screen. You've got one of the VHT power amps behind your head there, and it's enormous, right? But then I look down there and I see the LX2, and it's single space, all tube, and I've heard one before. It sounds freaking awesome. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
You also were the designer of the Synergy single space, I believe. Yes?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, coming from Detroit, in the automotive industry, you always heard the old phrase, there's no replacement for displacement. You know, when you're talking about big, powerful engines. And I think the same thing, I always thought the same thing about amplifiers. I'm thinking to myself, if I've got a big, giant power transformer and a big, giant output transformer, the thing is going to sound big. Lo and behold, you've squeezed everything into a single space rack and it sounds big. So what kind of witch doctory do you have going on with that thing?
Okay, well, there's two aspects to that. So let's start with the depth control because that's a key part of it. When I first came up with that, that was like 86 or 7. And I was a hi-fi buff, and I knew about damping, which is the behavior, it's a characteristic behavior of an amplifier where the design of the amplifier is such that it helps control the excursion of the speaker to improve linearity of the amplifier performance and to reduce distortion and to eliminate weird artifacts that the speaker, being a mechanical, fallible device that it is, to give the amplifier ability to sort of control out some of those undesirable speaker behaviors. That's what damping is. So I understood about damping, and Seymour Duncan convertible combo had a damping control on it, which I thought was interesting because I already knew what damping was, and some hi-fi amps had that. So I figured somebody at Seymour Duncan must have known something about that, and I was pretty intrigued by it. And when I played with it, it didn't match my understanding of what damping was. So I kind of got into it a little bit. And then when Rivera's power amp came out, he also had a damping control that was completely different in its behavior and operation. But I could see that there was like a trend there that were, designers are looking for unique little features and bells and whistles to apply to their gear. And that I totally understood that. What I had found when I was designing my amps was that a certain amount of low end needed to be controlled differently for clean sounds versus overdriven sounds. But there wasn't really, it was damping, but it wasn't necessarily damping. And I needed to figure out a way to identify what that was, and then figure out how to control it. So I started by getting more technically informed about how damping actually worked and how it could be manipulated. And once I started doing that, I realized that the presence control in an amplifier is a way to basically undo the linearity that the feedback network inside the amplifier imparts on the amplifier speaker performance. Feedback is used to linearize the performance of the amplifier, to reduce the noise, reduce certain kinds of distortion, and to flatten out some of the speaker behaviors so that you get a more true, accurate response, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do on a guitar amplifier. But it's instructive to be able to know how it works so that you can manipulate it. So in an amplifier, in a guitar amplifier, it also has a feedback loop, ostensibly for that same reason, but there's less of it. Its main purpose is just to reduce noise and basically improve the sound of the amplifier. So the presence control was just a feature that somebody came up with, that where you could reduce some of the negative feedback in the high frequencies and make the amp sound more lively. So if you wanted a little bit more sparkle out of the guitar, or if the amplifier was too bright for the guitar, say for example you're using a Telecaster in an amp that has a presence control, you might want to turn the presence down, which is increasing the high frequency negative feedback to flatten out the top of the guitar. And I thought, well, I'll just do the same thing on the low frequency. I'll make a filter that will reduce the amount of negative feedback in the low register only, kind of around the resonant point of the speaker. And all speakers have a resonant impedance peak, not the frequency response of the speaker, but the impedance response of the speaker. All speakers have this big resonant peak right around between 75 and 100 roughly hertz. And a low frequency version of the presence control would be helpful in tightening up or loosening up, allowing that peak to be more prominent or less prominent. So to be able to control that would be cool, because then you can make the amp sound snappier and tighter on the bottom end, or looser and more open on the bottom end.
Right.
So I came up with basically a simple filter to accomplish that, and it worked perfectly the first time. And I went, oh, that was just way too easy. I don't even know enough about electronics for that to have been that easy, but it was that easy. And I just thought, it's so easy that anybody could have thought of this. And it probably isn't anything that anybody would want to buy from me as something to put on their amps. So, and I don't know that I want to go pay an attorney to patent it. I don't know how much it would cost. It's probably more than I want to spend. It was early on in the development of the company, so I didn't know any lawyers, and all I knew was patents were expensive and time consuming, and I was like, I was too busy just trying to build amps. So I thought, you know what? I'm just going to bequeath this one to the world. I'm just going to put it out there, and I'll be able to say I was the first one to did it, and that'll be my little self pat on the back. That'll be fine with me.
That's cool.
Turned out 2 years later, another company thought it was such a great idea that they went and patented it after the fact. I didn't even realize that until years after they had patented it, that I could have reversed their patent because it was already in the public domain because I had put it there. And so they sort of took the glory of saying that they had invented the steps control, and I didn't say anything about it to them. I just kind of took it on the chin because I thought, well, I would never do that. And so I don't have any respect for anybody that would. But that was then, and this is now. It's since expired, and it's no longer an issue. I like the idea that people know where it really came from, not who said they patented it and they got a patent past the patent office that really wasn't legit. But the fact is, we had it in production on our amplifiers 2 years before another company patented it. But neither here nor there. What I have the satisfaction knowing is why it came into being in the first place.
Sure.
And with all of our designs and with all of our products, the first goal of the product design is that it has to have a good reason to exist. So a feature or a function or the product itself, the first order of business is that it has to have a good reason to exist. There needs to be a reason for this to be offered. We just don't put stuff out there and to hope that it sticks.
Right.
There's a reason we're putting the effort into it, because we think, And sometimes it's just, this is something that I need. And if it's something that I could use and I need, there's probably 1,000 guitar players that need or want the same thing. So maybe less, maybe more, but that's just sort of the philosophy. Having done that in that one particular model, it's like the EQ. It comes back and reminds me later on how actually useful and functional it is in terms of sculpting the behavior of the amplifier. Now, you talked about the horsepower, the big amp thing. Well, at the beginning, I overbuilt things just out of ignorance. I was a Harley rider. You just did things bigger. Mm-hmm. Because you just didn't want it to break.
Sure. But the big Transformers was not just you. I mean, the big Transformers was everywhere.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, everything was everywhere.
Right, but making that single space has to require a complete rethinking of what we've been seeing for years.
Well, first of all, the big amplifiers, like I said, they were built big and they were built rugged out of my ignorance. I'm just going to overbuild the shit out of it, so it will never be deficient in any way, shape, or form. And then shrinking it down just became a matter of competition. Mm-hmm. Mesa came out with a smaller power amp, and then Seymour Duncan came out with something similar to our 2150, but in two spaces. And I thought, all right, people are starting to shrink their racks down. So I came out with two scaled down designs, the two space amps, the 292 and the 252.
Sure.
Because that's where the trend was going. Had to figure out how to get that performance, that big amp performance, in a smaller package. It turned out it was pretty easy because a lot of the packaging was just about overdoing the shit out of it, and it didn't need to be all necessarily packaged in that big housing like that. It just so happened that it was. So it didn't really have to shrink things down too much to get the 2150 performance into the 292 package. Mm-hmm. And the 252 was just a no-brainer because it's 2 tubes per side, and the transformers were smaller anyway, so there wasn't any sweat in getting that performance in there. But the key to the flavor and the versatility of the power amp was tied up in the presence and depth controls. So the transformers had to have sufficient iron to be able to produce that low-end sort of wallop that the amplifiers were capable of, and they had to be a high enough quality output transformers so that they sounded nice on the top end when you turned the presence up. So in those amps, it wasn't that big of a transition. It was just not using so much extra hardware and materials to produce it.
Sure.
To get the cost down, to get the weight down, to get the size down. The LX2 was like, this is a later expression of my I dare ya attitude.
Right.
The challenge. I like a challenge, and to me, the challenge of now getting all that down into one space was like, if I pull this off, that'll be pretty cool,
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's possible. What drove that was that there was the progression towards smaller gear, mm-hmm. and the universal dissatisfaction with the one space amplifiers that were out at the time that were all 20 watts aside, mm-hmm. because the transformer, you had a physical limitation of the transformer size, specifically the output transformer. Power transformer, no problem. You do it with a toroid, it's a flat pancake, you put it in that size box. That's not a problem. But in the output transformer, they behave and sound a certain way because of their shape, and because of the way the magnetic field envelops the coils, and because of the way the coils are wound, and they all have these sort of characteristic behaviors that are and that are unique to that type of transformer. If you try to make an output transformer out of toroids, it's a totally different approach, and the result is totally different, and it won't sound like a guitar amp. It might sound good, but it won't sound like a guitar amp, or it won't sound like even just a normal what you'd expect to hear out of a power amplifier, even if it's not necessarily guitar amp voiced. It can be more neutral and still be lacking in personality. So how to get now a 50 watt per channel power amp in one space? You can do it with the tubes, you can do it with the power transformer, you can do it with, you can do it everything except the output transformers. All right, so so that's the stumbling block. How are we going to get past that? And I had been experimenting with flat pack power transformers for power supplies, and I didn't really like the way they worked because they made a lot of mechanical noise. But a couple of companies had used flat pack power transformers that have two legs, and the coils are wrapped around each of the two legs, and one coil is the primary and the other coil is the secondary, and the magnetic field flows around the core from one coil to the other coil, and they vibrate a lot. Mechanical vibration at 60 hertz and 50 hertz is pretty high, so they that's just like the characteristic flaw of the flat pack design. You ignore that in industrial equipment like welders and stuff because it doesn't matter, but in an audio amplifier that matters. So they don't work well as power transformers, and so I scrapped the whole idea of using them in our products. But I had been experimenting with them, and I was familiar with them. And when I started figuring out that I wanted to do a one-space power amp, I thought about the flat pack thing, and so I went to the engineer at one of the key engineers at one of our key transformer suppliers, and I told him what I was trying to accomplish, and I gave him some ideas about it, and he went, "That's really a weird dog way of approaching output transformer design." And I said, "Really? Nobody's ever asked for that before?" He says, "Nobody."
Wow.
Went, "Okay, that's nice." So I called a couple of different transformer suppliers that I had worked with, and you want a what? And one of the suppliers, there was a Russian guy who's no longer there. He's retired, but he was just crazy enough to entertain my craziness. So I told him what I was trying to accomplish and how I thought it should be accomplished. And he says, "Yeah, I think you might be right. I think you might be right about that. Let me play around with it a little bit." So I got a couple of proposals from 2 or 3 different suppliers, and they were all pretty unique. But one of them worked better than the other two from a standpoint of shape and size and all that. And so in the process of developing that transformer design, I learned more and more about transformer design and the physics of it. So I studied that a little bit more, and then I went back and told him what I thought should happen based on what I had just learned. And he goes, that's kind of like early transformer design theory stuff that probably most transformer guys don't think about anymore, because they're working at these big companies where they just jam out transformers, and the engineering guys are using programs just like I use CAD for circuit board design and chassis design and stuff like that. They're plugging in parameters into typical form factors and giving the customer basically the current and the heat and the voltage and the power handling and all that stuff. They're just plugging in variables. They're not like scavenging around in oddball territory. But I'm the one that's doing that. So this guy, and I've had this relationship with transformer design engineers in the past. That's fun. They both said they like working with me because I make them think about things that they're not supposed to normally think about. And so he came up with this, and then I took that and I went, no, it needs to be more like this and more like this. So what we came up with was this, and we got a patent for it. At this time, I patented it because I know that nobody tried it, and I know that it's unique, and I know that it works. So we did patent it. But basically, each output transformer is 2 output transformers on one frame laying down flat.
Mm.
And they're wired in parallel. And they work like a humbucking pickup. So on the single core, there are 2 output transformers acting push-pull. So in a tube amplifier, you've got a primary that's split in 2, powered from the middle, and each end of the primary goes to one power tube, and the power tubes are driving each half of the primary.
Right.
In this transformer, that is happening, but each pair of power tubes is driving 2 output transformers in parallel, reverse wired like a humbucking pickup, and on opposite ends of the frame of a core, where not only are the primaries operating push-pull, but the actual transformer coils wrapped around the cores are operating in push-pull. But they're small enough that you can put them in a flat profile, and so it all fits. So they're wider and longer, but they're flatter, which is exactly what we needed to accomplish. And they're in a really tight space, and they're all crammed closely together and very close to the power transformer. And because they're wired like humbucking pickups, they buck the hum from the power transformer. So they don't pick up the noise from the power transformer by being too close to it. And they don't, when one transformer that's really close to the other one interjects the sound from the right channel into the left channel's transformer, the transformer also rejects that noise because it's rejected in it's bucked out by the transformer design itself. And those are all side effects that I discovered after we put the whole package together and realized that what was going on. And part of the patent is wrapped around that interference rejection that that this new design inherently imparted to the design. So what that means is that there's actually 4 output transformers in there. So twice as much iron as a 20-watt amp would be. So it's a 50-watt amp. And it's the same amount of steel that you would have in a 50-watt output transformer, but it's just spread out driven by 2 separate coils on each end. It's kind of built the same way a Volkswagen engine is, a horizontally opposed.
Yeah, like a boxer style
same
engine.
Concept. And so because it's a big iron transformer, it doesn't look like it, but it's still a big iron transformer, just like the bigger amps, and that's why it can produce those low-frequency fundamentals. And then using the depth control, you can vary that to bring up the low-end resonance if you want. And the only limitation is the output power. Our 252 power amp is 2 spaces. It's actually 65 watts a side. This one it's capped out at 50 watts because the tubes are so close to the chassis. We don't want too much heat. And we had to come up with a fan system to deal with the temperature rise to make sure that it was safe and all that, and efficient cooling and so on and so forth. And it has to be rugged enough to get thrown around, which pretty easy because the chassis is fairly simple. And the wide, long output transformers, the mounting bolts are far enough away that when you bolt them together, it actually adds strength to the chassis. So they're actually a structural member of the chassis. There's a lot of rigid support for the transformers inside. So the whole package is nice and solid, and it can be thrown around just like the big ones.
And that thing weighs 22 pounds?
At 22 pounds.
22 pounds. And what's your street price on that? It's $1,200? $1,300?
$13.99.
$13.99.
Yeah.
So for $13.99, you're getting a stereo all-tube power amp made in the USA, 22 pounds. People out there that are playing, the Axe effects and all this stuff, that's the power amp that they should be buying.
Yeah, I mean, I licensed the design to Synergy, and I made them a similar one. Friedman wanted to behave a little differently, and I incorporated his requests into that design. This is, It's got a little bit different reason to exist than this one. This one's a couple $100 more. There's a reason for that. Part of it is the output transformer we use are produced a little differently. We use paper insulated transformers, which is it's not as machine friendly of an assembly procedure as tape. Mm-hmm. And in the hi-fi world, paper insulated transformers are preferable because they put a little bit more separation between the layers of wines, and the paper doesn't act as much like a capacitor as tape does. Mm. So that opens up the high frequency response, gives them a little bit more transparency, and it also stabilizes the layers of wines. So when they wind the transformers, the layers, each layer of windings sit right evenly on top of each other. With tape, it's possible for the wire, the top layer, to interact a little bit with the lower layer because the tape is very thin, it's plastic, and it'll give under the pressure. So what happens there is there's more distributed capacitance between those layers of wines, and that capacitance builds up and it sort of rolls off some of the high frequency response. It also, when they lay unevenly differently, it tends to make the transformers less consistent sounding from one to the next. So the paper wrapped ones are more expensive to produce. They produce this nicer, more transparent top end, and they're more consistent. But they are more expensive than that, and the CNC machined front panel, and a couple of other little minor things in there sort of, add to the cost.
Sure.
We probably don't make as many of them as Synergy does, so our unit cost is a little bit higher. But the main difference is that the output transformers are produced differently, and so they're more expensive.
You had more to do with Synergy as well, right? Did you do some design work with the pre's?
Yeah, I did the Syn 1 and the Syn 2. I did all the circuit board layout for those, and I did a lot of the internal implementation of some of the circuit path. I mean, it's a collective project. Everybody, Bruce and Dave, and everybody had a lot of input into the feature set and how everything functions and stuff. But I used a lot of my past experience to sort of execute on some of that circuitry interface kind of stuff. And I helped, I co-developed that cathode switching circuitry with Bruce, which is something that we'd been doing for a long time, but Bruce had some ideas about it too. And so we kind of batted around behaviorally wise, what that cathode switching was supposed to accomplish. Right. And then I fleshed it out into an actual design so that it would be really simple to implement. So that, and then I also licensed them the SAG control, which is a feature that I originally designed and I patented for the GP3 preamp. That was our 3-channel, two-space rack mount preamp. That's what the SAG control was originally designed for, which was in a guitar amplifier, as you turn the volume up, the plate voltage, the power supply voltage starts to go down under load. Right. And when you really hit an amplifier with power, that load sag becomes more prominent up to the point where it just goes down to a point and stops, and then it recovers. So I had to come up with a circuit that would fool the power supply into sagging the exact same amount of voltage that would normally happen in a guitar amplifier that you push, and then figure out how to make it do it reliably. So I had done that in the GP3, and then we put it in the GPDI so that it not only would have the overdrive and the clean sound, and it's got a little 1-watt power amp built into it so that it would drive a speaker, so it sound and have a touch sensitivity and dynamics of a guitar amp, but also have the sag feature. To do that, it triggers the signal coming off of your guitar and tells the power supply how much to sag, and you control that with a knob. So that we had already had, and so I incorporated that into the Sin 1 and Sin 2, and
is that the same thing as your dynamic sensing technology?
That is the dynamic. That was what it was.
Oh, okay. Got it.
How it was patented under the technical description of the patent was that it senses your picking attack, right, and then triggers a voltage regulator circuit that tells it when to dip or not to dip.
Sure.
When the synergy projects were out of the way, then the next logical thing was, okay, now you're going to start working on your modules. So I went, okay, so we're going to do the ultra lead first because people know the ultra lead, and so I went to work on it. What I didn't tell them was I think I can jam an EQ in there. Right. Because as soon as word gets out there that there's going to be an ultra lead module, the very next question is going to be, how are they going to get the EQ in there, or is it going to have the EQ? Because as it happened, each EQ became so tightly associated with the ultra lead. Mm. So I immediately went to work on how I was going to be able to get the EQ in there. And I didn't tell them that that's what I was doing because I didn't know if it was going to work, if I was going to be able to pull it off. I didn't want to shoot my mouth off and then not be able to deliver it. So that's what I did. And so when I did find the pots that would fit and figure out a form factor where I could jam everything in there, then I showed it to him, and I got the reaction that I wanted, which was nobody is crazy enough to try something like that, which is kind of the reaction I got for the LX2. I love that. I love it. I love it when Dave Friedman sends me a text that says, "I fucking hate you. You're an asshole." That means I did something good. Right. And I have David Torn does that. "You're a punk ass little fucker. Fuck you." I'm like, okay, Dave, what did David Torn? I said, Torn, what did I do right? And he goes, that new blah 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 blah. I didn't want to say genius because I don't want to blow smoke up your ass. And I go, thank you. That was the best compliment I had all day. And so yeah.
See, this does lend credence to that pioneer compliment earlier. Sorry.
It's curmudgeonliness. It's contrarian. I like the reaction, but I think mostly I like to challenge myself and see what I'm capable of, and when I pull it off, I don't want to do this, but if it
sure.
And I think people know me well enough we're close enough friends that they know me well enough that I not only will not take offense to something like that, I will take it in the spirit that it's given and love it for that. And sure. I do love that. I love that relationship with Friedman. I love that relationship with the other artists that we work with. And so when the Ultra Lead was done, I was thinking about putting colored lights and backlighting the sliders with colored lights, but I thought, no, that's too low rider probably for my taste. So I decided not to do that. And then, of course, as soon as I showed it to him, the Avi goes, it'd be cool. And so now it has blue backlit, so that when the EQ comes on, the sliders are backlit blue, right. And it looks really nice. So okay, that worked out well. And then
it's an awesome sounding preamp.
Once I'd gotten all the bits and pieces in place on the Ultra Lead, then the Deliverance was an easier accomplishment because it uses some of the same technology and it was already there, and it gave me more freedom to make the Deliverance module. But consequently, at the same time, we're releasing the new Deliverance 2 amp that had these enhancements over the old one. So it's perfect timing that the Deliverance module is coming out with the same enhancements the Deliverance 2 had.
I'm looking forward to the Deliverance 2 head. I want to hear it. I'm a fan of that first run of those heads. Those heads were great.
It's pretty much the same. It just has this other additional little level of wood. The best way I can describe it is it's a little bit more wood. Mm. The soul of the guitar, the body right. Wood personality of the guitar comes through on the new version a little more than previous. Not a ton. I didn't want to piss off the guys that already have them because it's a really nice amp. And when you sit them side by side, most of the settings that you set it for will sound very similar. There's just this extra little to come out and be a Series 2, besides having the effects loop in it and having the high gain mode foot switchable, which wouldn't make sense to have that unless you could adjust the volume for the second gain setting. So the solo master, those three things are probably enough to justify the Series 2, but it should be more than that, because didn't we learn anything between the time we made it the first time and the time it comes out again? Didn't we learn anything that we can apply, that we can sort of give to people to show that, yeah, there still is a progression, there's still room to move, there's still things that we can zero in on that maybe initially in the design process it didn't raise itself as a priority. And I think songwriters will relate to this, that when you're crafting a piece of music, you're putting all these elements, you're thinking and how it all goes together, and then once it's all together, you sort of cleared your mental space out. You cleared all that execution garbage out of the front of your head. And it leaves space for these other little ideas to rise to the top. And my problem has always been those things are rising to the top simultaneously with completing the project. And it tends to make me want to go back and, oh, you know what I just thought? And they're getting the ropes out. No. Get it into the market. Just get it. It's beautiful the way it is. Shut up. And I'm like, yeah. So on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. And it's just like, it's like a remixing an album. You come back and you come back years later and you've got new technology. You've got better outboard gear, better monitors, better, engineers and producers hear things different ways. The demographic has changed. The way people hear music has evolved. And so it's fair to say that certain little subtle characteristics can evolve along with that. And so the Deliverance has always had its own little following and its own true believers. And I don't want them to feel like they're missing out on anything. But we also have to recognize that there is that evolution going on. And I'm sorry to say it, but modeling technology is amazing. And the development of it is on the fast track. It's really awesome, really, really awesome, and all the things that you can do with it. But it is replacement technology. It's not a unique thing in and of itself that is bringing a personality to the table. It is a replacement technology. It's giving you virtual bits and pieces of things that you need to pick and out of a palette when the situation calls for it, but it's not the inspiring piece of musical equipment, the other half of the instrument, which is the guitar and the amp. It's not that. It just is not that. It never will be. And I say that without any hesitation. Just had a big discussion with somebody the other day about how to use the Axe effects together with our power amp to get the right amount of reactive blah, blah, blah. Well, you can just take the reactive component out of the Axe effects. And they're talking about the Axe like it's a tube amp inside there and that you could separate these elements and then replace them with external elements. And it's absolutely not so. There's a virtual element inside that you turn on and off, and another virtual piece of the puzzle that you turn on and off. But they're all virtual pieces of this puzzle, and you can mix and match, and all that's wonderful. But they do not make the hair on your arm stand up when you play a chord a certain way, and then you get this little feedback bubbling to the top, and you hear this funky little coming out of the speaker that you don't know what it is, but it sounds just right, even if it's wrong. It's just not that. So it's valid to enhance and evolve a guitar amp design that's already existed, it's been in the market for 10, 15 years. It's a perfectly valid exercise. There's still room for big amps. They have a characteristic. They have a personality all their own, and nothing touches that. Little amps are cool because you get to kick them around at low volumes and make them sort of grunt and groan like big amps, but they're still little. They're not big. Like you were talking about the Transformers getting that big footprint experience out of a little box like that. You don't get it unless you design it into there so that it does come out, and that's expensive because it's iron. It's more of it. It's heavier. It's can't be replaced with Class D technology. All those other little alternative technologies have their place because of their cost, their weight, and their inherent reliability. They're pretty bulletproof, and they're also so cheap that if it breaks, you just don't even bother trying to fix it, which is kind of the downside because then it becomes, landfill material. But and the technology changes so quickly that it becomes obsolete really quickly, and on and on and on and on and on. Going back to your question about reliability, that's what makes tube amplifiers have such relevance decades beyond what they reasonably should have had, because they're the foundation of all that, and it's irreplaceable.
Yeah, you're not wrong, man. I've tried a few times, tried modelers, nothing replaces it. I've heard people say for the last 25 years, eventually we won't be able to get tubes anymore. Well, I'm turning the corner. I'm no longer, a guy that's going to go out and tour or any of that stuff. And they're still there. I can get them.
Guy says that.
I can get them all day long.
To the guy that says that to me, not going to be able to get tubes anymore, I say, when was the last time you replaced the tube in your amplifier? Probably like 85, 86. Thank you. Yeah. Next.
But even regardless of that, they're everywhere. You can get tubes at 1,000 different places online and a handful of places in the city.
When people say that that tube amps are going to be obsolete because you can't get tubes anymore, they're forgetting the fact that they are so inherently reliable, and there are so many of them that you can talk like that all you want, but it's going to be another 30 years before you're not going to be playing an amplifier by the time you have to think about that. You're going to be long gone. They're still going to be around because they are around. If that wasn't the case, original Tweed Fenders wouldn't be still in use on the road today. It's just the evidence is so overwhelmingly there that there isn't even any reason to have that conversation. There just isn't.
Yeah.
I have people talk about new old stock tubes. I say, did it ever occur to you that you don't know what a brand new Brimar sounds like? If you had a brand new of your favorite esoteric Brimar 12AX7 in your hot little hands right now and set it next to the most recent Shiguang Chinese 12AX7 that pretty much everybody uses, I'll bet you would be hard pressed to hear the difference between the two. And it wouldn't be that one is a million times better than the other one. It would be that the difference in personality between that one and that one is just the same as the difference in personality between the black plate RCA and the Philips this and the Sylvania that. There's more difference in personality between those tubes than there is in inherent tone quality and reliability between the Shuguang and something like one of those cherished new wall stock tubes. I love those things, but I've never heard a brand new one in a guitar amp. Neither have you, and neither has anybody and any of the people that talk about them with such reverence. It's great, but you got to remember that a glass, the vacuum in a 12AX7 or any tube, the vacuum in there is not a static, fixed value over infinity. It depletes over time. Not a whole lot, but if you're a tweaker, enough for you to be able to hear the difference. Now, inside a tube, there's a thing called a getter, and it's got a chemical compound in it that is, its job is to absorb extraneous gases that enter the envelope over time. And it's a vacuum. So that means there's more pressure on the outside of the bottle than there is on the inside. And that means it's possible for gases to enter into the envelope from the outside over time and reduce the validity of the vacuum. A small amount, but enough.
Right.
Some of that gets absorbed by the getter, but the getter gets saturated over time and can't absorb as much anymore. So by the time 50 years have gone past, even in a tube that's never been used, it's still been invaded by external materials getting inside, and that affects the performance of that. So my point to you is, you've never heard an original one. So you can't compare a 50-year-old new old stock tube to a brand new production tube and say, this one is just inherently better because of the materials and blah, 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 blah. Well, material selection, perfect example. Maybe I'm running too far afield, but material selection changes because regulations change and technology changes. Perfect example, steel. We use high silicon steel in our output transformers. It's been supplied by the same supplier for decades and decades. Our transformers always sound the same because of that. However, there are guys out there that say, oh, you know, I have to rewind a transformer using the original steel core because it's different. Yeah, it's different. It was made differently on different equipment. That steel was, you know, in the fabrication of that steel, the tolerances were very wide for how hot the ovens were and how stable the temperature was and when the steel was being formed. These days, those parameters are a lot tighter because those furnaces are computer controlled. So the manufacturing tolerances, the production tolerances are a lot tighter than they used to be for the same material. So yes, the new materials behaves a little differently than the old material. So it's the same as the material that's inside the tubes. Well, we had a batch of transformers for the 252 power amps a few years ago when the Chinese production engine was going crazy and they were absorbing all the concrete and all the steel and all the copper. They were just like sucking it all up. And it was driving the prices of those materials up in the US, and transformer suppliers were scrambling to get enough material to make transformers for their customers. And the prices that we were paying were going up on a weekly basis. So we get a batch of transformers for the 252s, and all of a sudden they're not behaving the same way. And we check with them what's going on with these transformers. They're not working the same way. And they check their specs. Everything's the same, everything's the same, everything's the same. Check everything. Everything's the same, everything's the same. Same steel? Well, essentially the same. What? Well, you know, we can't get as much American-made steel as we need to get. So we have purchased some of the same grade of material from China. It's the same grade. They certified it. And here's the certification paper saying it's the same, blah, 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 blah. 2 years before that happened, I was talking to Steve Blucher, who was the main pickup designer.
Yeah, DiMarzio.
DiMarzio, who's a good friend of mine and brilliant and great ears. And he had a device that measured the magnetism of the magnets that they were buying for their pickups. And he said, watch out for the material that comes from China. I'm not saying it's bad or not as good as the other stuff. I'm just saying you got to watch it because it can be different.
Mm.
The same grade. And I went, well, I wonder how that's never going to affect me. Well, a few years later,
behold,
the transformer guy calls me back and he says, oh, by the way, actually it's the same steel, but it's from a different supplier. Okay, make me 2 transformers of this. Can you still get the same steel that you used before? Oh yeah, we have it. It's a little more expensive. Fine. They made me 2 transformers. We put them in the amplifier and they worked fine. The Chinese steel was not lower quality. It was actually higher quality. It was a more refined formulation of the same grain-oriented steel that we were using in the transformers, and they certified it as such. However, it was improving the efficiency of the transformer in the high frequencies, which increased the high frequency response. The amp has negative feedback in it. That means at high frequencies, there was more negative feedback at high frequencies, and that was making the amp oscillate at 100 kilohertz. Nobody can hear this oscillating, and it doesn't show up in a scope. We're just testing it at audio frequencies. But there's humming in the amplifier. It was humming because it was putting out full power at 100 kilohertz. You couldn't hear. You could see it in the power supply that the voltage was down, and there's all this ripple. You could see that the power supply was working overtime, but you couldn't hear it.
Wow.
Because of this one characteristic. Okay, so we could have modified the feedback loop to reduce the high frequency feedback to stop the oscillation. Then we have a pre-loop modification production and a post-loop modification production that we would have to manage and think about and document and all that and wonder about what's going to happen if somebody has a certain kind of a speaker that when they plug it into JBLs or something, maybe it acts weird. We can't afford that. So we had to go back and say, look, the steel is probably fine. And yeah, we could change the design, but we don't want to change the design. We need to keep the specifications consistent because we don't know what carpet we're going to have to peel back and find the bugs underneath it later. So you have to really look ahead when you're talking about materials. And you have to understand how those materials affect performance. And then you have to gauge the consumer's perception of what that means to them against what it means to consistency in production and quality. That's the battle. Everybody knows everything because they've all read it all on the internet. Yeah. But what they don't know is what's going on behind the scenes that drives these decisions. They're regulatory. There's changes in advancements in technology. There's worldwide material sources that have different characteristics. There's all kinds of things that go into that. Sure. And the longer and the more that you do manufacturing, the more you have to balance all these new things that you learn. But that's the beautiful thing about doing this is, man, you never get bored and you never stop learning new stuff.
Sure, man. With this much attention to detail, it's no wonder that the Fryette amps sound the way they do. They sound as good as they do. People go to Fryette.com. It's FRYETTE.com. I'm going to put it on the screen right there. Steve, I got so much out of this conversation.
I did too.
Thank you so much for spending the time telling the stories. There were moments where I had the hair standing up on the arm. It was excellent.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, man. I definitely owe you dinner and drinks once this thing is over with.
Oh man, I can hardly wait.
Yeah. Well, I say once this thing is over with. People who are watching right now who've managed to stay up this late with us, we are still in quarantine here in LA, which is why I said that. So, anyways. All right, Steve, I'm going to let you go. Again, thanks so much. People, again, go to Fryette.com. Support this guy's business. This guy makes the best stuff you can buy. SoundCityAmp.com. Check that one out, too. And with that, I bid you adieu.
Thank you for the conversation. I appreciate it. And same to you.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Take care.